At the dawn of the Second World War, Latvia found itself caught between two expanding powers whose ambitions would determine its fate. The country, which had gained independence in 1918 after centuries of domination by larger empires, sought throughout the interwar period to preserve neutrality. Yet Latvia's geographic position between the Soviet Union to the east and Nazi Germany to the west ensured that neutrality could not be maintained once hostilities began in Europe. The signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on 23 August 1939, with its secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, sealed Latvia's future. By this agreement, Latvia was placed under Soviet influence, while Lithuania and Western Poland were assigned to Germany. Less than a year later, the Pact's provisions would lead directly to the destruction of Latvian sovereignty. In June 1940, following the fall of France, Soviet forces issued ultimatums to the Baltic states. Latvia, with a population of roughly 2 million and a modest army of about 25,000 men, could not resist the Red Army, which had already positioned significant forces in the region. Soviet troops occupied Latvia on 17th of June 1940, and the country was incorporated into the USSR as the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic. Within a year, political and social structures were reshaped under Moscow's direction. Private property was nationalized, political parties banned, and security organs carried out arrests and deportations. In June 1941, during the first mass deportations, over 15,000 Latvians were sent to Siberia and Central Asia, including political leaders, officers, intellectuals, and their families. This repression created deep resentment and fear within Latvian society, and set the stage for how many would later respond when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. When Operation Barbarossa began on 22nd of June 1941, the German Army Group North advanced rapidly through the Baltic. Within weeks, Riga fell, and by early July, much of Latvia was under German control. For some Latvians, German forces were initially perceived as liberators from Soviet occupation, especially given the memory of recent deportations. Others, however, were wary of German intentions, recognizing that Nazi policy did not aim to restore independence, but to incorporate Latvia into a broader plan for German expansion. The German Occupation Administration established Reichskommissariat Ostland, with Latvia placed under German civil administration. This structure would shape all subsequent military, political, and social developments within the country. The war created multiple and often conflicting loyalties. On one side, the German authorities sought to mobilize Latvians for military service in the fight against the Soviet Union. On the other, Soviet partisan activity in the forests of Latvia aimed to resist German occupation and prepare for the eventual return of Red Army forces. Between these two powers, Latvian society was fractured. Some Latvians joined German-sponsored formations, motivated by anti-Soviet sentiment, hopes of protecting their homeland from renewed Soviet rule, or simple coercion. Others, often those whose families had suffered under Nazi occupation policies or who remained loyal to the Soviet system, supported or joined the Partisans. The early German military presence relied on auxiliary police battalions, often composed of Latvians, who were tasked with security operations, rear area protection, and anti-partisan activities. Over time, these units became the nucleus for larger formations. By 1943, under pressure from the Eastern Front's demands, the German authorities formed the Latvian Legion of the Waffen SS. This was not a single event, but a process involving multiple recruitment drives, both voluntary and compulsory. Official German records list about 87,000 Latvians serving in Waffen SS formations by 1944, though not all had joined willingly. The Legion would later fight in major battles along the Eastern Front, particularly in the defense of Latvia as the war turned against Germany. At the same time, Soviet partisans, initially weak and isolated, grew in strength. In 1942, partisan detachments were small, numbering only a few hundred fighters scattered across Latvia's forests. By 1944, with increased Soviet supply drops and organizational support, partisan groups expanded to several thousand, carrying out sabotage operations, ambushing German patrols, and attacking supply lines. Their presence forced German authorities to commit additional troops to security operations, which diverted resources from the front. The civilian population bore the consequences of this dual struggle. German occupation policies included forced labor, requisitions, and severe restrictions on cultural and political life. The Jewish population of Latvia, numbering about 7,000 before the war, was systematically targeted for extermination during 1941-1942, with the participation of German Einsatzgruppen and local auxiliaries. At the same time, the Soviet partisan movement also exacted reprisals against those accused of collaborating with Germans, while German counterinsurgency efforts frequently led to collective punishments against villages suspected of aiding partisans. Ordinary Latvians faced a constant dilemma: survival under two regimes that both demanded loyalty and punished dissent. Thus, by 1943, Latvia had become a battlefield not only for the German and Soviet armies, but also for competing visions of the country's future. To the Germans, Latvia was a resource base and a strategic corridor to Leningrad and beyond. To the Soviets, it was a republic to be reintegrated into the USSR. To Latvians themselves, the war presented impossible choices. Whether in German uniforms, Soviet partisan detachments, or simply as civilians caught between opposing forces, they experienced the destruction of their land and the erosion of their fragile independence. This context, occupation, repression, forced mobilization, and divided loyalties, set the stage for the final years of the war, when Latvia would once again become a front line as the Red Army advanced westward. By the middle of 1942, the German occupation of Latvia had settled into a more systematic form, but it was marked by contradictions. The Reichskommissariat Ostland, with its headquarters in Riga, sought to integrate Latvia into a centralized German-controlled administration. German officials imposed economic controls, demanding deliveries of agricultural products, timber, and labor to support the war effort. At the same time, they discouraged any expression of Latvian national identity or political aspirations. Cultural organizations were restricted. The press was tightly censored, and education was limited to emphasize obedience rather than autonomy. This created disillusionment among those Latvians who had initially hoped that German victory would bring some measure of independence. Militarily, German authorities faced an urgent problem. Heavy losses on the Eastern Front meant that they needed additional manpower. Beginning in late 1941, Latvians were recruited into auxiliary police battalions, numbering more than 40 units by 1943, with a combined strength of approximately 20,000–25,000 men. These formations were deployed for security operations, anti-partisan warfare, and guard duties, but also saw frontline combat in places such as Leningrad and Belarus. The nature of their tasks often brought them into direct conflict with Soviet partisans, and their actions deepened divisions within Latvian society, as some viewed these men as collaborators, while others considered them protectors against a Soviet return. In early 1943, as German defeats at Stalingrad and elsewhere strained resources, Berlin authorized the creation of the Latvian Legion within the Waffen SS. Officially established in January, it initially drew on existing police battalions and volunteers. Recruitment was accompanied by intense propaganda emphasizing the defense of Latvian soil against Bolshevism. Posters, speeches, and radio broadcasts framed service in the Legion not as loyalty to Germany, but as a patriotic duty to protect Latvia from renewed Soviet occupation. Nevertheless, by mid-1943, the number of volunteers proved insufficient, and conscription measures were introduced. Men born between 1919 and 1924 were drafted, and by the end of that year, nearly 4,000 Latvians were serving in Legion divisions. Two main divisions emerged: the 15th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Latvian, and the 19th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 2nd Latvian. These units, though under German command and organizational structure, were composed largely of Latvian personnel, including officers promoted from auxiliary ranks. Their training followed standard SS protocols, but the language of command at lower levels remained Latvian, and many soldiers identified themselves as fighting for their homeland rather than for the Third Reich. The contradiction between German strategic goals and Latvian national aspirations remained unresolved, shaping the Legion's complex historical legacy. Meanwhile, in the forests and marshlands of eastern Latvia, Soviet partisans worked to rebuild their presence after the rapid German conquest of 1941. Early attempts at partisan warfare had been fragmented, with many detachments destroyed by German countermeasures. By 1942-1943, however, the Soviet central headquarters of the partisan movement established stronger organizational links. Supplies were flown in from Soviet bases, and partisan brigades expanded, numbering several thousand fighters by late 1943. Their activities included blowing up railway tracks, sabotaging communications, and ambushing German patrols. These actions disrupted German logistics and spread fear among collaborators, but they also led to brutal reprisals. German security forces often responded by burning villages and deporting suspected supporters, adding to the civilian toll. The population faced impossible choices. Young men risked arrest if they resisted conscription into the Legion, but joining the partisans carried equal danger as German intelligence networks and auxiliary police sought to root them out. Families were divided, with brothers sometimes serving in opposing forces. Rural communities found themselves between two hostile powers, pressured to provide food to German garrisons while secretly aiding partisan groups. This duality created an atmosphere of mistrust, where survival often required silence or shifting allegiances depending on which authority was closest. By late 1943, as the Eastern Front shifted westward, Latvia's position grew increasingly precarious. German defensive lines extended through the Baltic, while Soviet offensives pressed toward the region. The Latvian Legion prepared for deployment in large-scale battles, while partisan forces anticipated the return of the Red Army. At the same time, the German occupation intensified labor mobilization, deporting thousands of Latvians to work in Germany's war industries. Cities like Riga, Daugavpils, and Liepāja became hubs of military and logistical activity, their populations strained by shortages, curfews, and constant surveillance. Thus, as 1944 approached, Latvia stood divided and exhausted. The German command relied heavily on Latvian manpower to sustain its crumbling front, while Soviet partisans sought to undermine occupation structures from within. The country had already lost much of its autonomy, its Jewish community nearly annihilated, and its political elite dispersed through exile, imprisonment, or execution. The stage was set for the decisive campaigns of 1944, when Latvia would once again become a contested battleground in the struggle between the Wehrmacht and the Red Army, with the Latvian Legion and Soviet partisans playing increasingly central roles. As 1944 began, the wider strategic situation on the Eastern Front was undergoing a decisive transformation. The Red Army, having secured victories at Stalingrad and Kursk in 1943, launched a series of winter and spring offensives that pushed the front line steadily westward. Army Group North, which had occupied the Baltic region since 1941, was gradually forced into retreat. For Latvia, this meant that the territory would once again become the site of large-scale battles, with German and Soviet forces preparing for a confrontation that would decide the country's immediate fate. The Latvian Legion, formerly divided into the 15th and 19th Waffen Grenadier Divisions, was now deployed in active frontline combat. In early 1944, the 19th Division held defensive positions along the Velikaya River near Pskov, a critical sector that shielded the northern approaches to Latvia. The 15th Division, meanwhile, was transferred to central Russia, eventually taking part in operations near Novgorod. These units were integrated into German corps and army structures, but their ranks remained predominantly Latvian. Reports from the period indicate that approximately 87,000 Latvians were serving in Waffen SS formations by mid-1944, a number that included both frontline divisions and support units. The Soviet Union's strategic aim was clear: to cut off Army Group North and reclaim the Baltic republics. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944 against Army Group Center, destroyed much of the German front in Belarus and created the conditions for a rapid Soviet advance toward the Baltic. In July, the Red Army initiated the Šiauliai Offensive, pushing through Lithuania and threatening to sever the land connection between German forces in Latvia and those in East Prussia. German High Command responded by shifting both German and Latvian divisions to defensive positions, attempting to stabilize a collapsing front. Inside Latvia, the German occupation intensified its mobilization efforts. In early 1944, further conscription drives brought in men born between 1925 and 1926, swelling the ranks of the Legion, but also increasing resentment among civilians who viewed forced service as a continuation of foreign domination. Families faced the dual burden of losing young men to conscription, while also enduring increasing requisitions of food and labor. German propaganda continued to frame the struggle as a joint fight against Bolshevism, but many Latvians understood that they were being used to sustain German military positions that were no longer defensible. At the same time, Soviet partisans expanded their operations, particularly in Latgale and Vidzeme, where dense forests provided cover. By 1944, partisan numbers had grown to over 1,000 across Latvia. They targeted railways linking Riga with the German front, ambushed convoys, and disrupted communication lines. These actions often coincided with Soviet regular offensives, serving as a force multiplier. However, reprisals were severe. German security divisions, supported by Latvian auxiliaries, launched sweep operations, burning villages suspected of harboring partisans and deporting inhabitants. The result was a cycle of violence in which civilians bore the heaviest costs. Urban life also deteriorated as the front drew closer. In Riga, air raids became more frequent, damaging infrastructure and forcing thousands to flee to the countryside. German authorities requisitioned factories for armament production, and food shortages worsened as Soviet advances cut off supply routes. By summer 1944, Riga had become a military hub, crowded with Wehrmacht units, administrative offices, and field hospitals. Civilians lived under strict curfew, with arrests and deportations continuing until the final days of the occupation. The shifting balance of power became evident in late July 1944, when Soviet forces approached the Latvian border. In battles around Ostrov and Idritsa, the Red Army pressed against German lines held by the 19th Division and other Axis units. Despite heavy casualties, these forces managed to slow the advance, buying time for German commanders to regroup. Yet the momentum clearly favored the Soviets, whose numerical superiority was overwhelming. Across the Baltic sector, Soviet forces committed over 1.5 million men, while German strength in the region, including Latvian formations, barely exceeded 35,000. The political implications were equally profound. Exiled Latvian leaders who had fled to Germany hoped that Western allies would intervene to prevent Soviet reoccupation. These expectations were not realized. Allied policy, shaped at conferences in Tehran and later Yalta, accepted the Soviet claim over the Baltic states, leaving Latvia's fate tied to the outcome of the Eastern Front. Within the country, resistance to both occupiers persisted, but lacked the organizational strength to alter events. Civilians increasingly focused on survival, whether by hiding from conscription, fleeing westward with retreating German units, or attempting to remain neutral in an environment where neutrality was scarcely possible. By the end of summer 1944, the decisive confrontation was imminent. The Red Army had reached the borders of Latvia, preparing for a major offensive that would push into the Baltic republics. German forces, including the Latvian Legion, braced for defense, aware that retreat meant not only military defeat, but also the return of Soviet authority. For the people of Latvia, the coming months promised renewed destruction, mass displacement, and a reshaping of their society under conditions neither side had allowed them to control. In September 1944, the long-anticipated Soviet push into Latvia began. The Red Army launched the Baltic Offensive, a series of coordinated operations designed to clear German forces from the Baltic states and cut off Army Group North from retreat into East Prussia. 3 Soviet fronts participated: the First Baltic Front, the Second Baltic Front, and the Leningrad Front. Altogether, nearly 1 million Soviet troops, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft, advanced against approximately 400,000 German and auxiliary forces defending the region, including the Latvian Legion's divisions. The The strategic goal was not only to recapture the Baltic territories, but also to isolate German formations in what would later become the Courland Pocket. For the Latvian Legion, this marked its first large-scale confrontation with Soviet armies on Latvian soil. The 19th Waffen Grenadier Division took up positions along the defensive line stretching from Madona to Riga, while the 15th Division was redeployed westward after suffering heavy losses in battles around Ostrov. These units, reinforced but under-equipped compared to their Soviet opponents, relied heavily on fortified positions, natural obstacles such as rivers and forests, and the experience of their soldiers, many of whom were veterans of earlier campaigns. Despite their efforts, the sheer weight of Soviet offensives forced them into continuous withdrawals, punctuated by desperate counterattacks to delay breakthroughs. One of the critical battles occurred near the city of Riga in October 1944. Soviet forces sought to encircle the Latvian capital by striking from the east and the south, threatening to trap both German units and tens of thousands of civilians. German High Command, recognizing Riga's limited strategic value compared to preserving manpower, ordered a withdrawal to defensive lines in western Latvia. The Latvian Legion, alongside German divisions, fought delaying actions to cover the retreat. On 13th of October 1944, Soviet troops entered Riga. The capture of the capital marked a symbolic and strategic turning point. Latvia's largest city, once the administrative hub of German Ostland, was now under Soviet control again. The fall of Riga did not end the fighting. German and Latvian forces retreated into the Courland Peninsula, where they prepared for a protracted defense. There, Army Group North, later renamed Army Group Courland, would hold out until the final days of the war. For many Latvian Legion soldiers, this meant years of combat condensed into months of defensive warfare, with little hope of victory, but the determination to resist Soviet reoccupation for as long as possible. Approximately 2,000 German troops, including around 4,000 Latvians, became encircled in Courland, cut off from the rest of the Eastern Front by advancing Soviet forces. While large-scale military operations shifted westward, Soviet partisans in Latvia were rapidly absorbed into the advancing Red Army. Partisan detachments that had operated in isolation were now incorporated into regular Soviet units, serving as scouts, guides, and local support elements. Their knowledge of terrain and networks of contacts were invaluable for consolidating Soviet control over recaptured areas. At the same time, these detachments carried out reprisals against individuals accused of collaborating with German authorities, further deepening divisions within Latvian society. For civilians, the Soviet return was both an end and a beginning. The German occupation, marked by forced labor, executions, and requisitions, came to a close. Yet the memory of the Soviet occupation of 1940 or 1941, and particularly the deportations of June 1941, caused widespread fear. Many families chose to flee westward with retreating German forces, seeking refuge in Germany or beyond. Estimates suggest that over 100,000 Latvians left their homeland during this period, either voluntarily or forcibly, becoming displaced persons in camps across Central Europe. Those who remained faced a swift reimposition of Soviet authority, which brought arrests, renewed collectivization efforts, and preparations for political trials. The economic situation was catastrophic. Years of occupation, scorched earth tactics by retreating German units, and the devastation of battles had destroyed infrastructure, transportation networks, and farmland. Cities like Daugavpils and Jelgava were heavily damaged during fighting, while Riga, though spared large-scale destruction during its capture, suffered from shortages and the dislocation of its population. Industrial production had collapsed, and the countryside bore the scars of both German requisitions and partisan warfare. Rebuilding would be slow, and Soviet priorities were primarily military and political, not humanitarian. Politically, the Soviets moved quickly to restore the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic as an integral part of the USSR. Local communist cadres, many of whom had spent the German occupation in Russia, returned with Red Army units and assumed positions of authority. Security forces, NKVD units, arrived to re-establish control, conducting screenings of the population to identify potential enemies of the people. Former members of the Latvian Legion, auxiliary police, and anyone suspected of collaboration faced arrest, execution, or deportation. Entire families were often targeted, echoing the repressive patterns of 1941. For the soldiers of the Latvian Legion who remained encircled in Courland, the situation became a prolonged stalemate. Between October 1944 and May 1945, 6 major Soviet offensives attempted to eliminate the pocket, each involving tens of thousands of troops. Despite being cut off, German and Latvian forces resisted, making use of fortified positions and naval resupply through the Baltic Sea. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the encircled forces continued to hold their ground. For many Latvian soldiers, Courland became less about Germany's war aims and more about avoiding Soviet capture for as long as possible, even as the larger conflict moved inexorably toward Germany's defeat. Thus, by the end of 1944, Latvia's fate had largely been sealed. The capital was in Soviet hands, the countryside under Red Army control, and only the Courland Pocket remained as a final stronghold of Axis resistance. The destruction of Latvia as an independent political entity was complete, replaced by Soviet rule that promised further upheavals. Yet, the presence of tens of thousands of armed Latvians in Courland demonstrated that the struggle was not entirely over. The next months would see continued fighting, mass displacement, and the irreversible integration of Latvia into the Soviet sphere, even as individual soldiers and civilians sought survival amid the war's closing stages. The battles in the Courland Peninsula during late 1944 and early 1945 represented one of the longest encirclements of the Second World War. After the Soviet capture of Riga in October 1944, Army Group North, renamed Army Group Courland, was trapped in western Latvia. Isolated from the rest of the Eastern Front, it consisted of approximately 22,000 troops, including German divisions, Latvian Legion units, and various support elements. The Red Army, determined to eliminate this pocket, committed several armies totaling more than 400,000 men, supported by armor, artillery, and air power. Yet the encirclement persisted until the very end of the war in Europe, making Courland both a symbol of prolonged resistance and a zone of immense destruction. The first Soviet assault came in late October 1944, only days after the encirclement was established. Soviet forces of the First and Second Baltic fronts attacked along a broad front, seeking to split the pocket into smaller sections. The 19th Latvian Division was deployed near Saldus, while German divisions held positions along the Venta River and near Tukums. Defensive preparations, combined with difficult terrain of forests and marshes, allowed the defenders to repel the offensive, though at high cost. Reports suggest that in this first phase alone, Soviet casualties reached tens of thousands, while German and Latvian forces also suffered heavy losses but managed to maintain cohesion. Further offensives followed in November and December 1944. The Red Army increased its artillery bombardments, attempting to overwhelm defensive lines, but German and Latvian troops utilized fortified trench systems, minefields, and counterattacks to blunt the advances. The 15th Latvian Division, redeployed from central Russia, was thrown into the fighting to reinforce collapsing sectors. Casualty rates among Latvian formations were severe. Some battalions lost over half of their men in a matter of weeks. For Latvian soldiers, Courland became synonymous with attrition, a defensive struggle in which survival depended less on hopes of victory than on endurance. At the same time, the strategic value of Courland was debated within the German High Command. Some generals argued for evacuation, suggesting that trapped forces could be redeployed to defend East Prussia or Germany itself. Hitler, however, insisted on holding the pocket, both for political reasons and to maintain naval control of Baltic sea routes that supplied remnants of the Kriegsmarine and facilitated refugee evacuations. This decision condemned Army Group Courland to months of isolation. Supplies arrived by sea from ports in East Prussia and Denmark, but shortages grew acute, particularly in fuel and heavy equipment. Soldiers relied increasingly on local resources, requisitioning food from the already devastated Latvian countryside. For civilians trapped in the Courland Peninsula, conditions were grim. Villages lay between fortified lines, subject to artillery fire and air raids. Many inhabitants fled westward toward the coast, hoping to board German ships evacuating soldiers and refugees to Germany. By early 1945, tens of thousands of Latvians had been evacuated across the Baltic, joining the broader flow of displaced persons from Eastern Europe. Others were unable or unwilling to leave, enduring bombardments and the destruction of farmland. Accounts from survivors describe constant movement between makeshift shelters, shortages of bread and livestock, and the fear of reprisals from both sides, depending on which army controlled a particular area. The Soviet command launched additional offensives in January and February 1945. These were timed alongside the massive Vistula-Oder offensive and the encirclement of East Prussia, part of a broader strategy to crush remaining German strongholds. Once again, however, Courland held. The defenders benefited from compact defensive lines, naval artillery support from German ships off the coast, and the determination of units that saw no alternative but to resist. For the Red Army, Courland became a secondary front. Resources were increasingly diverted toward the drive into Germany, while the containment of the pocket was sufficient for strategic purposes. The Latvian Legion's role in these battles was central but tragic. The divisions, already depleted, were continuously engaged in frontline fighting. Soldiers faced artillery barrages, tank assaults, and relentless infantry attacks. With every failed Soviet offensive, casualties mounted, and replacements were scarce. German officers often praised the discipline and effectiveness of Latvian formations, but these acknowledgments could not change the reality that many soldiers viewed themselves as fighting for Latvia's survival rather than Germany's collapsing empire. The paradox of their position, wearing German uniforms while hoping to prevent Soviet domination, remained unresolved. By spring 1945, with Berlin itself under attack, Courland's isolation deepened. Communication with the Reich became sporadic, and the defenders were increasingly aware that the war was lost. Nonetheless, orders remained to hold the line. 6 major Soviet offensives had been launched against the pocket by April 1945, all unsuccessful in breaking it completely. Soviet estimates indicate that German-Latvian defenders inflicted significant casualties, but at the cost of tens of thousands of their own dead and wounded. The land was devastated, forests shattered, fields cratered, and villages abandoned or destroyed. For those Latvians who had fled with German evacuations, life as refugees in Germany presented new uncertainties. They were placed in camps alongside civilians from other occupied territories, dependent on German authorities struggling with collapse. Many hoped to avoid Soviet repatriation after the war, aware that returning to Latvia under Soviet control could mean imprisonment, deportation, or worse. This diaspora would later form the nucleus of the Latvian exile community in Western Europe, North America, and beyond. Inside Soviet-occupied Latvia, meanwhile, the Red Army consolidated control over regained territories. Security operations continued against remaining armed groups, including small partisan detachments that resisted Soviet authority even after German withdrawal. The NKVD carried out arrests of suspected collaborators, while preparations began for post-war reconstruction under Soviet administration. For those who had supported the partisans, the Soviet return was presented as liberation, but for many others it marked the return of repression, surveillance, and fear. Thus, the battles of Courland symbolized both persistence and futility. For the Germans, it was a demonstration of their ability to hold ground despite encirclement. For the Soviets, it was a contained distraction while they advanced elsewhere. For Latvians, it was a crucible in which tens of thousands were sacrificed, civilians displaced, and the land destroyed, with no possibility of achieving the independence that many had hoped to preserve. By May 1945, Courland remained one of the last active fronts in Europe, a battlefield whose outcome was never in doubt, but whose human cost was immense. By May 1945, the Courland Pocket remained one of the last surviving fragments of the Third Reich's Eastern Front. When Berlin fell on 2nd May and Hitler's successor Karl Dönitz ordered localized surrenders, the isolated forces in Latvia received their final instructions. On 8th May 1945, the remnants of Army Group Courland, still numbering about 2,000 men, including roughly 4,000 Latvians, formally capitulated to the Red Army. The surrender was accepted by Soviet General Ivan Bagramyan of the First Baltic Front. Unlike in Germany proper, where the war's end brought a rapid cessation of hostilities, in Courland the formal handover was preceded by confusion, sporadic skirmishes, and an atmosphere of deep uncertainty among soldiers and civilians alike. For the Latvian Legion, surrender carried unique consequences. German troops were processed as prisoners of war, but Latvians, being Soviet citizens by Moscow's definition, were treated differently. Many were arrested as traitors or collaborators, facing deportation to labor camps in Siberia. Estimates suggest that between 13,000 and 15,000 Latvians were deported in the immediate post-war years, including former soldiers, their families, and individuals suspected of supporting the German occupation. Legionnaires who attempted to hide their service were often exposed through Soviet records or local denunciations. A smaller number managed to evade capture by retreating westward earlier in 1945, blending into refugee flows that reached Germany or Sweden. The broader civilian population of Latvia faced a rapid re-Sovietization process. Within weeks of the Red Army's return, the Communist Party of Latvia re-established authority, supported by NKVD and Red Army units. Land reforms were announced, reversing German measures and reimposing collectivization. Factories were nationalized, and schools were reorganized to teach in accordance with Soviet ideology. The press was brought under strict censorship, erasing any trace of wartime German administration or pre-war independence. To many Latvians, the abrupt reappearance of Soviet symbols, red flags, portraits of Stalin, and the reintroduction of Soviet currency signaled that their country's political fate was sealed. Economically, Latvia was devastated. Agricultural output had collapsed, with much of the harvest requisitioned or destroyed during the retreat. Transport networks were in ruins, rail lines had been sabotaged, bridges blown up, and ports heavily damaged by naval bombardments. Riga, though spared large-scale destruction in its capture, was stripped of machinery and industrial equipment by both retreating Germans and incoming Soviet authorities. Entire factories were dismantled and sent eastward to the Soviet Union as reparations. Housing shortages plagued the capital and regional cities, as wartime bombardments and fires had destroyed thousands of homes. Rebuilding began quickly, but under conditions of strict central planning, prioritizing military and heavy industry over civilian needs. Social conditions were equally harsh. In the months after the war, Soviet security services conducted mass screenings to identify potential opponents. Former Legion members, auxiliary police, civil servants of the German administration, and even those with relatives abroad were subject to interrogation. Thousands were arrested and sent to gulag camps in Vorkuta, Norilsk, or Kazakhstan. Families of the accused were often deported with them. At the same time, Soviet propaganda celebrated the liberation of Latvia, holding parades in Riga and public ceremonies honoring Red Army soldiers. The contrast between official celebrations and widespread private fear revealed the deep divisions that the war had carved into Latvian society. In the countryside, remnants of armed groups refused to lay down their weapons. These included former legionnaires, nationalist fighters, and others unwilling to accept Soviet rule. Known collectively as the Forest Brothers, they conducted guerrilla operations from 1945 onward, targeting Soviet officials, police, and infrastructure. Though poorly supplied, these groups drew support from segments of the rural population, who provided food, shelter, and intelligence. The Soviet response was uncompromising. NKVD units carried out large-scale search operations, deploying thousands of troops to sweep forests and eliminate resistance. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were subject to collective punishment, including deportations and executions. Latvia's demographic structure was profoundly altered. The wartime Jewish population, once numbering about 7,000, had been almost entirely annihilated by 1942, leaving only a few thousand survivors who returned or emerged from hiding. German occupation policies and the Holocaust had erased centuries of Jewish presence in Latvia's towns and villages. Meanwhile, the war and its aftermath displaced hundreds of thousands of Latvians, those deported east, those evacuated west with the German military, and those living in displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria. The result was a fractured nation, with a large exile community abroad and a traumatized population at home. Internationally, the question of Latvian independence was effectively closed. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Allied leaders had accepted Soviet control of the Baltic states as part of post-war arrangements, despite the fact that Western governments continued to recognize the pre-war Latvian Republic de jure. For Latvians in exile, this meant the preservation of diplomatic legations in London, Washington, and other capitals, but no practical influence over events in Riga. For Latvians under Soviet rule, it meant the integration of their country into the USSR for nearly 5 decades. By the summer of 1945, Latvia had been transformed once more into a Soviet republic, with its institutions restructured, its population divided between survivors, deportees, and exiles, and its land scarred by years of occupation and warfare. The Waffen SS Latvian Legion, the Soviet Partisans, and the civilian population had all played roles in the conflict, but none had been able to shape the outcome according to their own vision. The destruction of the war's final years left behind not only physical ruins, but also unresolved questions of loyalty, identity, and survival. The legacy of these events would continue to shape Latvian society long after the last shots in Courland had been fired. In the immediate post-war years, Latvia became a stage for both reconstruction under Soviet control and resistance against that very order. While official Soviet narratives emphasized liberation and socialist progress, the lived reality was marked by repression, shortages, and ongoing conflict. The return of Soviet authority in 1944-1945 did not bring stability, but instead inaugurated another cycle of political persecution and armed struggle that would last for nearly a decade. One of the defining features of this period was the emergence of the Forest Brothers, an armed resistance composed of former Legion soldiers, nationalist activists, and ordinary farmers who refused to accept Soviet rule. Their ranks swelled after 1945, as men returning from the front sought to avoid arrest by Soviet authorities. Many had already been marked as enemies of the state due to their service in the Waffen SS or German auxiliary units. For them, hiding in the forests of Kurzeme, Vidzeme, and Latgale was a matter of survival. Estimates suggest that by 1947, as many as 15,000 Latvians were involved in partisan activities, supported by wider networks of sympathizers providing food, clothing, and intelligence. The tactics of the Forest Brothers were diverse. They carried out ambushes against NKVD patrols, assassinated local communist officials, and disrupted transportation links. Their activities spread fear in rural areas, forcing the Soviet authorities to commit large numbers of troops to counterinsurgency operations. The NKVD, later renamed the MGB, deployed tens of thousands of men in sweep operations, using informer networks, mass arrests, and even aerial reconnaissance to track down resistance fighters. Battles in the forests often resulted in heavy casualties, with captured partisans facing immediate execution or long sentences in labor camps. The Soviet government also sought to eliminate the social base of resistance. Collectivization of agriculture, begun in 1947 and intensified in the early 1950s, aimed to dismantle the independent farming class that provided support to the partisans. Private farms were forcibly merged into collective farms, kolkhozes, with quotas set for grain, milk, and livestock deliveries. Those who resisted faced confiscation of property or deportation. The mass deportation of March 1949, known as Operation Priboi, targeted over 42,000 people in Latvia alone, mainly farmers, suspected collaborators, and families of partisans. Entire households were loaded onto trains and transported to Siberia and the Far East, with little prospect of return. This operation was one of the largest demographic shocks in Latvian history, reshaping rural society for generations. At the same time, Soviet authorities promoted industrialization and urbanization as part of their broader program of integration. Riga became a hub of heavy industry, with factories producing machinery, electronics, and chemicals. Investments in infrastructure brought electricity, rail expansion, and housing projects, though shortages remained severe. Migration from other parts of the Soviet Union, especially Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, altered the demographic balance of Latvia. By the 1950s, a significant share of Riga's population consisted of Russian-speaking newcomers, while ethnic Latvians made up a declining proportion of the urban workforce. This demographic shift further complicated the post-war social fabric, introducing new cultural and linguistic tensions. For former legionnaires who survived capture, the consequences were varied. Many were imprisoned in Soviet camps, serving long sentences in harsh conditions. Others managed to conceal their past and reintegrate into civilian life, though always under the shadow of suspicion. A small number, evacuated westward in 1944-1945, remained in Germany or emigrated further to the United States, Canada, Australia, and elsewhere. In exile, they formed veterans organizations that sought to preserve the memory of the Legion as a force that had fought against Soviet domination, while distancing themselves from Nazi ideology. This interpretation would remain controversial, both within Latvia and internationally, as debates continued over collaboration, coercion, and national survival. The Soviet partisan movement, which had operated in Latvia during the German occupation, was officially celebrated in post-war propaganda as the true embodiment of Latvian patriotism. Monuments were erected, memoirs published, and anniversaries commemorated. School curricula emphasized the heroism of Soviet fighters who resisted fascist occupation, while ignoring or condemning the role of the Legion and the Forest Brothers. This state-directed memory shaped how generations of Latvians were taught to view the war, creating a sharp contrast between official history and private recollections within families who had experienced repression. Meanwhile, the physical landscape of Latvia bore enduring scars. Entire villages in Courland remained in ruins from the battles of 1944-1945. Fields left fallow during wartime had to be reclaimed, often with reduced productivity. The ports of Liepāja and Ventspils, heavily damaged by bombing and naval action, were slowly rebuilt to serve as strategic bases for the Soviet Baltic fleet. Riga, though not destroyed to the same degree as cities in Germany or Poland, still required extensive reconstruction, with housing shortages lasting well into the 1960s. By the late 1940s, the Soviet state had largely succeeded in crushing organized resistance. The Forest Brothers, once a widespread force, dwindled in numbers under relentless Soviet pressure. By the early 1950s, only isolated groups remained, and their activities were increasingly sporadic. Yet the memory of their struggle endured, preserved in local stories, exile writings, and underground networks of dissent. Thus, the years immediately following the war were not a simple period of peace, but an extension of conflict by other means. Latvia's population faced deportations, collectivization, industrial transformation, and demographic change, while armed resistance smoldered in the forests. The competing legacies of the Latvian Legion, the Soviet Partisans, and the Forest Brothers created a complex historical inheritance that defied simple categorization. For ordinary Latvians, the late 1940s were a time of survival in the face of overwhelming external control, as the final chapter of wartime destruction gave way to the enduring structures of Soviet occupation. By the early 1950s, Soviet control over Latvia was firmly entrenched, but beneath the surface, the legacy of the war and the immediate post-war years continued to shape daily life. The defeat of the Forest Brothers' armed resistance did not end opposition to Soviet rule. Rather, it transformed into passive forms of defiance, private remembrance, and exile activism abroad. The Latvian experience of the war, divided between the Waffen SS Legion, Soviet partisans, and the civilian population, remained unresolved in both memory and politics. The process of collectivization had by this point fundamentally altered the rural landscape. Independent farms, once the backbone of Latvian society, were absorbed into kolkhozes and sovkhozes, eliminating the economic autonomy that had sustained partisan resistance. Productivity in agriculture initially declined, as many peasants resisted collective farming, or lacked incentives to work under the new system. Soviet authorities compensated by importing machinery and technicians, often from other republics, and by enforcing delivery quotas. Those who failed to meet obligations risked fines, imprisonment, or deportation. For many rural Latvians, the transition meant the loss of property, social status, and a way of life that had endured for generations. Urban life underwent a different transformation. Industrialization projects, particularly in Riga, Daugavpils, and Liepāja, expanded rapidly in the 1950s. Factories producing electronics, machinery, and textiles became integrated into the Soviet economic system, supplying both civilian and military needs across the USSR. These projects required a labor force that exceeded Latvia's population, leading to significant migration from Russia and other Soviet republics. The demographic consequences were profound. By the late 1950s, Latvians constituted just over half of Riga's inhabitants, a dramatic change from the pre-war era when they had formed a clear majority. Russian became the dominant language of administration and industry, while Latvian was increasingly confined to private and cultural spaces. For former Legion soldiers, the Stalinist years were marked by continued repression. Many who had survived initial arrests were still in labor camps, enduring sentences that lasted a decade or more. Some returned after Stalin's death in 1953, but reintegration was difficult. Their wartime service remained a stigma, and their opportunities were limited by political restrictions. The memory of the Legion lived on most strongly in exile communities abroad. In Germany, Sweden, Canada, the United States, and Australia, Latvian displaced persons had formed organizations that published memoirs, held commemorations, and lobbied Western governments to refuse recognition of Soviet annexation. These diaspora communities became custodians of an alternative narrative, that Latvians had fought not for Hitler but against Soviet occupation, and that their independence had been unjustly extinguished. Soviet propaganda offered an entirely different interpretation. The narrative emphasized the heroism of Soviet partisans, the loyalty of Latvians who had supported the Red Army, and the progress brought by socialism. The Waffen SS Legion was portrayed exclusively as a criminal collaborationist force, with no acknowledgement of coercion or the context of Soviet deportations in 1941. History textbooks, films, and public monuments reinforce this view, creating a stark division between state-sanctioned history and the memories preserved privately within families or abroad in exile. The population at large struggled to adapt to these competing realities. Publicly, loyalty to Soviet power was required, demonstrated through participation in state holidays, labor campaigns, and collective organizations such as the Komsomol. Privately, many Latvians maintained a sense of national identity through language, traditions, and underground networks that circulated forbidden literature or commemorated banned anniversaries. Church communities also became subtle centers of cultural resistance, even as religious practice was discouraged by the state. At the same time, Latvia's strategic location on the Baltic coast gave it importance within the Soviet military system. Ports such as Liepāja were developed into naval bases for the Baltic fleet, and airfields across the country hosted Soviet aviation units. Large tracts of land were closed to civilians due to military restrictions, further reducing local autonomy and deepening the sense that Latvia was being used primarily for imperial purposes rather than local benefit. The memory of wartime destruction lingered throughout society. Cemeteries across Latvia contained graves of both German and Soviet soldiers, often maintained under different traditions and interpretations. Families remembered brothers who had fought on opposite sides, some in Legion units, others in the Red Army or partisan detachments. The unresolved legacy of these divisions meant that silence often prevailed in public, while private conversations revealed the complexity of individual experiences. For many, the war was not a story of liberation or collaboration, but of survival under impossible conditions. By the end of the 1950s, Latvia had been reshaped politically, socially, and demographically. Armed resistance had been extinguished, but cultural resistance endured. Soviet modernization had transformed cities and industries, but at the cost of profound demographic change and loss of autonomy. The exile communities abroad kept alive the idea of Latvian independence, even as the reality within the republic was one of integration into the Soviet Union. The competing narratives of the Waffen SS Legion, Soviet partisans, and civilian victims remained unresolved, forming a contested memory that would resurface decades later when independence once again became a possibility. By the 1960s, the violent upheavals of the war and immediate post-war years had receded into the background of daily life, yet their consequences remained embedded in Latvia's political, social, and cultural fabric. The country was firmly under Soviet control, presented to the outside world as a loyal republic of the USSR. On the surface, industrial progress, urban growth, and integration into the Soviet planned economy suggested stability. Beneath that surface, however, deep scars endured from the years of conflict, occupation, and forced transformation. The legacy of the Latvian Legion remained particularly complex. Within Latvia, discussion of the Legion was prohibited, except in the negative terms prescribed by Soviet propaganda. Official narratives described Legion veterans as traitors who had fought for fascism and against their own people. Veterans who survived labor camps were denied full rights, barred from many professions, and subjected to continuous surveillance. Yet, privately, many families remembered sons, brothers, and fathers who had served not as ideologues, but as conscripts or men seeking to prevent Soviet domination. In exile, the Legion's memory was more openly maintained, with reunions, memoirs, and publications that framed it as a national army, forced to fight in German uniform. This divergence created two parallel histories, one public and Soviet, the other private and diasporic. The Soviet partisans of the war years, in contrast, were celebrated. Memorials were erected in towns and villages. Schools were named after partisan leaders, and their stories were included in official textbooks. Commemorations each year emphasized their heroism in fighting the German occupiers, with little mention of reprisals or the complexities of their role in a divided society. In this way, Soviet authorities shaped the memory of the war into a narrative of unity under Moscow's leadership, leaving no space for acknowledgement of the broader spectrum of Latvian experiences. Civilians continued to live with the long-term consequences of wartime deportations and post-war repressions. Families separated in 1941 and 1949 remained scattered across Siberia and Central Asia, many unable to return. Letters and occasional visits were possible after Stalin's death. But reintegration was difficult, and survivors carried both physical and psychological scars. The demographic shifts caused by deportations, combined with the influx of Russian-speaking migrants during industrialization, permanently altered Latvia's ethnic balance. By the 1970s, Latvians made up barely over half of the total population, a sharp decline from their pre-war majority of around 3/4. This demographic transformation shaped politics, education, and cultural life, further complicating how the wartime years were remembered. Economic reconstruction proceeded, but always within Soviet priorities. Riga developed into a major center of industry, producing radios, electronics, and machinery for the entire USSR. Liepāja became a key naval base, closed to foreigners and heavily militarized. Railways and highways connected Latvia more closely with Russia, integrating it into Soviet logistics. These developments brought jobs and urban growth, but did not address the cultural losses or the sense of dislocation that many Latvians felt. For older generations, memories of pre-war independence contrasted sharply with the new reality, while younger generations grew up under Soviet institutions, experiencing the war only through official propaganda or fragmented family stories. Exile communities abroad, particularly in Western Europe and North America, played an important role in keeping alive alternative memories. Latvian émigré newspapers, publishing houses, and cultural societies worked to document the wartime experience in ways forbidden inside the USSR. They preserved archives of Legion veterans, partisan accounts, and testimonies of deportations. They also lobbied Western governments to maintain the legal continuity of the Latvian Republic, arguing that Soviet annexation was illegal. This diaspora activism ensured that the question of Latvian independence, though suppressed at home, remained alive internationally. Inside Latvia, acts of cultural resistance continued. Writers, poets, and artists found subtle ways to reference lost independence or wartime suffering, often in allegorical form. Folk traditions, music, and language became tools of quiet opposition, reminding Latvians of their distinct identity. At the same time, state authorities monitored intellectual life closely, suppressing works that deviated from the official narrative. Universities and schools taught Soviet interpretations of the war, while alternative views circulated only in whispers or private circles. The war's physical legacy was also ever-present. Battlefields in Courland, bunkers, and cemeteries dotted the landscape, reminders of the scale of fighting that had taken place on Latvian soil. Some were repurposed as Soviet memorial sites, emphasizing Red Army sacrifice, while others were left untended. Families continued to visit graves in secret, maintaining private rituals of remembrance. The land itself bore the scars: unexploded ordnance, destroyed villages, and altered demographic patterns testified to the enduring consequences of the conflict. By the 1980s, as the Soviet Union entered a period of stagnation, the contradictions surrounding Latvia's wartime experience became increasingly visible. Official commemorations of Soviet partisans and Red Army victories contrasted with private memories of loss, deportation, and divided loyalties. The Latvian Legion remained absent from public discussion, yet it survived in exile publications and in the guarded recollections of families. Soviet control had silenced overt resistance, but it had not erased the diverse and conflicting legacies of the war. Thus, 4 decades after the fighting had ended, Latvia lived within a layered history, one imposed by Soviet power, another preserved abroad, and a third whispered in homes and communities. These competing memories prepared the ground for later debates, when independence movements in the late 1980s would reopen unresolved questions of collaboration, resistance, and survival during the war's final years. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union's hold on Latvia was weakening under the pressures of economic stagnation, political reform, and the rise of national movements. The legacies of the Second World War, long suppressed or reframed by Soviet propaganda, resurfaced as central questions in the struggle for renewed independence. The history of the Latvian Waffen SS Legion, the Soviet Partisans, and the wartime devastation of the country became focal points of debate, remembrance, and political symbolism. For decades, these subjects had been contested in exile communities abroad, while inside Latvia, official narratives had silenced alternative perspectives. With glasnost and perestroika, these boundaries began to break down. Latvians seeking to reclaim national memory faced a difficult task. On the one hand, Soviet historiography had presented the war as a straightforward story of fascist occupation and heroic partisan resistance. On the other, the exile community had emphasized Latvian suffering under both Nazi and Soviet rule, portraying the Legion as a conscripted force that symbolized resistance to Soviet domination. Reconciling these perspectives required confronting uncomfortable realities: collaboration with German authorities, participation in war crimes by some Latvian units, mass deportations under Soviet rule, and the immense civilian toll exacted by both occupying powers. The search for historical balance became a central feature of post-Soviet memory politics. As independence movements gathered strength, the memory of wartime deportations and Soviet repression emerged as unifying symbols. Commemorations of the June 1941 deportations, once conducted only in secret, became public events, with thousands gathering to honor the victims. Memorials were erected at sites of deportation and execution, and survivor testimonies were published. These acts challenged the Soviet narrative and emphasized Latvia's victimhood under Stalinism. At the same time, the question of how to interpret the Latvian Legion provoked heated controversy. Annual gatherings at cemeteries, particularly at Leisten, brought together veterans and younger generations, while opponents, especially Soviet loyalists, condemned such events as glorification of fascism. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought independence, but it did not resolve these debates. Instead, they became part of Latvia's national identity in the post-Soviet era. The Legion was officially recognized as having been largely composed of conscripts, but its commemorations remained contentious both domestically and internationally. For many Latvians, Legion veterans represented men who had been forced to fight in a war not of their making, trapped between two totalitarian regimes. For Russia and some international observers, however, any association with the Waffen SS carried the stigma of collaboration with Nazi Germany. This divergence ensured that the memory of the Legion remained politically charged. The Soviet partisan legacy, once celebrated, underwent its own re-evaluation. While their role in resisting German occupation was acknowledged, Latvians increasingly emphasized the violence that partisan detachments had inflicted on civilians, and the fact that they had operated in service of restoring Soviet rule rather than Latvian independence. Local histories and archival research revealed the complexity of their actions, breaking with the simplified heroism of Soviet propaganda. In public consciousness, Soviet partisans came to be seen less as liberators than as instruments of a returning occupier. Civilian suffering emerged as the central theme in post-war remembrance. The destruction of villages, the annihilation of the Jewish community, the deportations to Siberia, and the massive displacement of refugees in 1944-1945 were remembered as collective tragedies. Museums, monuments, and educational initiatives highlighted these experiences, presenting Latvia as a victim of the geopolitical struggle between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. This framing allowed for a degree of unity in national memory, even as disagreements over the Legion and partisans persisted. The international dimension of Latvia's wartime history also played a role in the post-Soviet era. Exile communities, long guardians of alternative narratives, now engaged directly with the newly independent state. Their archives, testimonies, and publications enriched the public record, while their political advocacy helped secure Western recognition of Latvia's independence. At the same time, tensions arose between émigré interpretations, shaped by decades of exile, and the lived experiences of those who had remained under Soviet rule. Bridging these perspectives required ongoing dialogue, shaped by generational shifts and scholarly research. Today, the story of Latvia in the Second World War remains deeply layered. The Waffen SS Legion, the Soviet Partisans, and the destruction of the country during the war's final years are not only historical subjects, but also symbols in contemporary debates about identity, sovereignty, and memory. For some, the Legion represents a tragic necessity, an armed force that sought to defend Latvia against Soviet reoccupation despite its German command structure. For others, it remains inseparable from Nazi institutions and crimes. Soviet partisans, once idealized, are now recognized as both resistors of fascism and enforcers of Soviet domination. Civilians, caught between these forces, are increasingly understood as the central victims of the era. The war's long shadow continues to shape Latvian society. Annual commemorations, public controversies, and scholarly research demonstrate that the struggle to interpret the past is ongoing. Yet the endurance of memory in exile communities, in family histories, and in national debate also shows how profoundly the years 1940, 1945 defined Latvia's modern identity. The country's experience was one of forced choices, divided loyalties, and immense suffering. In documenting these histories, Latvians continue to confront the legacy of a time when their nation was caught between two empires, and survival itself became the only common ground.